Okay, it just turned noon on the dot, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining Tegan and myself today. First off, we are gathered virtually around what we call Alberta, what is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We also acknowledge and thank this land that we all live on, which connects us, cares for us, and sustains us. And we make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. And as we make this acknowledgement, we must also acknowledge the history of colonization on this land and the pressing need to disrupt and dismantle the systems and structures that perpetuate the ongoing present-day impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities. So in that spirit, and as part of an effort to commit to living in different relationship, we welcome you to our presentation today, which is entitled Anti-Racist Service Delivery, Foundations for SLPs and Audiologists. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we jump in. You might have noticed your audio and video will be turned off, and it'll stay turned off for the presentation portion of the webinar. The meeting chat will be open to you for the duration of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on AXLPA's YouTube channel in about a week. And if you're having any technical troubles whatsoever, feel free to type into the meeting chat, and our lovely admin/tech wizard, Mackenzie, will be happy to help you out. So, since individual positionality affects the way in which an individual constructs and engages with this type of material, we want to start by sharing more about ourselves so that you can better understand our perspectives and our experience and how they inform our connection to what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll go first. My name is Sharia Ali. I was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a former British colony. Growing up, I wasn't a visible minority, but because of a holdover from colonialism, I experienced power and privilege disadvantages in society due to my gender, ethnicity, and in particular, because of the darker shade of brown of my skin. Now, post-colonialism issues aside, one of my favorite parts of the Trinidadian culture is the dialect, which I speak at home with my family, and when someone makes me angry when I'm driving. And I expend considerable energy and effort ensuring that I speak standard English outside of those situations, and especially when I'm functioning as an SLP. Now, I left Trinidad for university in New Zealand as an adult to study speech pathology, and since then I've lived in countries where I'm not of the dominant culture. And because of this, I've always been acutely aware of being one of the very few racialized people in SLP. And I've experienced explicit instances of racism and discrimination while I was training and in various workplaces, and also frequent instances of feeling conflict between my personal and professional identities. And sometimes I just felt like I didn't fit in my chosen profession. And these were issues I explored in depth when I went back to school in 2018. And a passion area that's developed for me since is the application of critical race theory to SLP. And I'm able to put all the research that I've done to work as a member of AXLPA's Anti-Racism and Anti-Discrimination Committee. And my belief is that change does not need to take time, and that change needs to be systemic in order to have any real impact. So I thank you for signing up to be part of that change today. And I'll just pass the mic to Tegan to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Tegan Hyrciw. I was raised in a rural community near Edmonton. My grandparents and my great, and I think in some cases great-grandparents, immigrated to North America from Germany, England, and Scotland in search of opportunity, safety, and a better life. As an English-speaking white person in Canada, I have always been a part of the cultural and linguistic majority in my personal and professional life. I've also been granted privileges related to my gender and sexual identity and my family's education and socioeconomic status. When I was a child, I was taught that racism was bad and that we should endeavor to be colorblind when it came to race. Well-meaning adults in my life figured that if we treated everyone equally, that was the best way to combat racism. As an adult, as I've learned more about the systemic nature of racism and discrimination and their more nuanced expressions and effects, and as I've heard more about the experiences of racialized people, I have committed to doing everything I can to be actively anti-racist. I would say I am somewhere just barely beyond the starting gate when it comes to this learning. I have been an active member of AXLPA's anti-racism and anti-discrimination committee since its inception, and I'm indebted to the members of this group who've generously shared resources and knowledge with me. I like to joke that my role is mostly to listen and to metaphorically bring people coffee, but that is truly how I see my work in this sphere. My hope is that by making anti-racism a central focus of my career, I can be a useful and supportive ally to racialized people in SLP and contribute to meaningful change to the systems that harm racialized clients and communities. It is also important for me to point out at this point that the content for this webinar was like 98% put together by Sharia, who knows so much in this area and brings others really graciously alongside her. So I will pass it back to her for the next slide.
Thanks, Tegan. So since this webinar is being presented on behalf of AXLPA, it's important to understand where the college sits on this issue as well. So on the college's anti-racism and anti-discrimination webpage, it states that although AXLPA aims to always be fair, objective, and unbiased, this does not preclude the existence of unconscious, unacknowledged, or unintended discrimination or racism. So the college acknowledges that racism and discrimination exist both in its internal functions and the functions that it regulates, and that is our professions. To address this and to help protect the public, which is its overriding mandate, the college has undertaken several initiatives to help move the needle towards culturally safe, equitable, and effective care. So this includes reviews of the standards of practice and the code of ethics, and the membership diversity survey, which you may have seen come out in some emails, and this is still active if you'd like to go and fill it out. So forthcoming changes to the standards and the code will require that members apply an anti-racist and anti-discrimination perspective to their clinical work, which is why the college is committing to educating its membership to become more competent in providing safe and equitable care. But the bottom line is regulated members of AXLPA should be aware that racism and discrimination are not acceptable, it won't be tolerated, and breaches may be considered unprofessional conduct. So for our agenda today, we'll start with an overview of concepts that are foundational to understanding issues of racism and discrimination. And for the second part, which is going to be everyone's favorite, I guess, we're going to break up into groups to discuss a scenario to practice linking and applying the foundational concepts we discussed to our clinical service delivery. And then we're also going to have time for questions and some discussion at the end. So our hope is with this webinar that after you've attended, you'll be able to have a basic understanding of key concepts related to anti-racism, that you'll begin linking these concepts to your clinical practice, that you'll be able to discuss with others how these concepts apply to your clinical setting. Now, we know that for some of you, the concepts discussed today may be brand new, and for others, it'll be a bit of a review. Or if you've already embarked on a journey towards anti-racism in your personal life, this presentation might help you make the link to your clinical practice. Wherever you're at is totally okay. Our hope is that this presentation will give you a framework or a new lens through which to see the world and particularly your work in it. We've tried to give as many examples as we can in today's presentation to help you make those connections to what you actually do and see day in and day out. We also acknowledge that this is merely a starting point, and I just want to say here that there are more PD sessions in the works that will take a more focused look at our professions and some more practical clinical skills to help with providing anti-racist care. So I included this slide on sensitivity. When I started putting this presentation together, it was during the summertime, and I was seeing a lot of news reports out of the US around protests regarding the inclusion of some of these concepts in school curricula. So I wanted to avoid people showing up with placards. So I just want to make it clear that while this presentation deals with some difficult issues such as race, privilege, and identity, there's no judgment of anyone's social identities or where you're at on your journey to being anti-racist. It's not an indoctrination, it's an opportunity to gain a better understanding of these issues. There's no requirement to share information or to have answers to some of the questions we might ask, but at any time you feel moved to do so, sharing is welcome. So following the global attention to Black Lives Matter in 2020, we've seen a real cultural shift in that matters of social justice and equity are now very much on the public policy agenda. So institutions and individuals at all levels are being asked to acknowledge and address any role they might play in reinforcing or upholding systemic racism and discrimination. Now, we know issues of social justice and equity have not traditionally been a focus in our professions, SLP and audiology. And so many of us will have had very little exposure to these issues, especially as they apply to the clinical setting. And naturally, there are some knowledge gaps around these issues. So a starting point to bridging these knowledge gaps is to gain a conceptual understanding and just learn the vocabulary around social justice and equity. So if we look at the anti-racism action continuum at the bottom of the slide, the foundations we discussed today will help to move an individual to a point of being able to recognize and to act when racism and discrimination occur. And education on this topic is a key step towards moving along the continuum to eventually being able to support others and prevent racism and discrimination. So we'll begin our conceptual understanding with the cycle of oppression. So being able and willing to act for social change requires the ability to see how the pathway of oppression links to the systems we work in, like healthcare and education. So the cycle starts with biased information. One very good example of this, to which we're all exposed constantly, is media portrayals of certain population groups. So think of who always plays a terrorist in action movies post 9/11, who always plays lead in romantic comedies, who always plays the academic or the nanny, et cetera, et cetera. Who do we always see being arrested for crime? And when you're constantly bombarded with biased information, this can lead to stereotyping, which is having a fixed image, belief, or distorted truth about a person or a group, and there's very little room for consideration of individual differences or social variation. So stereotypes can be positive, like when we think of some of the Canadian stereotypes that the world has. So all Canadians are really nice. They're walking around apologizing to each other all the time. Feel free to put some other Canadian stereotypes in the chat. Stereotypes can also be neutral. And one stereotype that I know that I have since I moved to Edmonton in 2017 is that in my mind, everybody loves Costco. But when a stereotype involves a negative way of thinking or a negative attitude towards a socially defined group or an individual from that group, this is a prejudice. And when someone acts on a prejudice, this is discrimination. So discrimination involves the denying of goods, resources, and or services, or just general mistreatment of members of a particular social group. And it's usually enacted from an agent to a target. So think of when a client refuses to be treated by a brown provider. That's discrimination. Their refusal is the act of discrimination that results from their prejudice or that fixed negative image they have that they apply to every brown person. The next step along is oppression. And that results when discrimination is supported by and occurs through social service institutions like healthcare, legal, education systems, etc. So the dictionary definition of oppression is the exercise of authority or power in a burdensome, cruel, or unjust manner. So that word power is key there because oppression serves to uphold power differentials in society. It benefits the group in society with access to power, and it denies goods, resources, services to other groups who don't hold power in society. So we see oppression or the unjust exercise of power in the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system and child welfare system, but in the significant underrepresentation in positions of power within government. So these statistics that we see, it's important to understand, they're not by coincidence. They didn't just happen. They happened by design in the policy and procedures that are in place that allow for oppression or that unjust exercise of power that targets Indigenous individuals. So another important point here is that an individual can be acting at any point in this cycle without even being aware of it. It takes awareness and vigilance to recognize when you're being exposed to biased information and to recognize how and when this might develop into a prejudice. And while you may not be personally acting as an agent of discrimination based on prejudices that you have, you may play a role in implementing policies and procedures that are oppressive. Another point here is that it isn't always what you do, but sometimes what you don't do that counts as discrimination and oppression. So institutions will rarely have policies that are explicitly oppressive, but many do have policies and procedures that fail to acknowledge the barriers faced by equity-seeking groups. And so their policies amplify rather than reduce these barriers to access and to safe and equitable care. So let's think of access to care for people who don't speak English in any setting. Organizations hopefully will not have policies that say we do not offer services to this group or we only offer services in English. But the policies that say that interpreter services are cost prohibitive or the policies that don't allow for translation of materials, they function much in the same way as explicitly barring access. So oppression takes many forms based on membership in various population groups, and these are known as the isms. Important point, not all of them actually end in ism. So isms are based on the false belief of superiority of certain groups and involves the use of social power, there's that word again, power, to deny access, resources, services, representation, etc. to other groups. So people who are disabled face oppression in society or ableism, or discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. Classism is discrimination or prejudice set up to privilege people of higher socioeconomic status at the expense of people in lower socioeconomic groups. So the smaller circles list some of the isms, but this is not an exhaustive list. It's just the ones that could fit in the graphic. So feel free to put some other examples in the chat box if you can think of any. And the flip side to these isms is privilege, which is defined as an unearned set of advantages, entitlements, and benefits granted only to a particular person or group of people. And it's exercised to the exclusion or detriment of others. So privilege is the advantages and the power that you get solely for being part of certain population groups. So for example, I'm someone who doesn't have any physical disabilities. So that means I'm able to easily access and navigate my way in the world. I can walk up any stairs, I can push open any doors, I can sit in any seating options, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The world is set up to allow me to easily move through it without any accommodations required. And that's not something I learned in any way. It just happens because I belong to a group of people who are not disabled. And one of the hallmarks of privilege is that it's often invisible to those who have it. So if you're reading some of these isms and you're like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, or even if you're thinking, I don't see how that can be a thing, it's likely that you are in the privileged position. It's also extremely important to understand that the isms don't occur in isolation of each other. So that's where the concept of intersectionality comes in. And intersectionality is the idea that the multiple intersecting aspects of an individual's identity amplify and compound the marginalization they may face. So intersectionality explains that while women in the workplace may experience sexism, a Black lesbian may experience compounded marginalization due to sexism, racism, homophobia. So an unfortunate example that frames intersectionality that's very close to home is the recent string of attacks on Black hijabi Muslim women in and around Edmonton. So these women had a very specific intersection of social identity. So they're visibly Black, visibly female, visibly Muslim, and that amplified the sexism, anti-Black racism, and Islamophobia that they faced to the point where they became targets of physical harm. So while our presentation today is called Anti-Racist Service Delivery, one point I hope you all take home is that our SLP and audiology clients may face compounded marginalization due to their membership in various population groups or the intersection of their isms. Clients are not able to leave the oppression they face at the door to your workplace, so the school or the hospital or the clinic that you work at. Their oppression impacts their everyday well-being, their quality of life, their health, and that includes their communication and hearing health. And it will impact your service delivery. So it is important that we are aware of the various forms that oppression can take and how to begin to link how they may apply to our clients. So the ism that we're going to spend some time unpacking today is racism. And often when people hear the word racism, they think of the extreme violent forms. So like South African apartheid, genocide of indigenous people around the world. However, racism, which is any program or practice of discrimination, segregation, persecution, or mistreatment based on membership in a certain race or ethnic group, has several levels. So individual racism is the assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors existing within an individual, and it's based on the thinking that one's own racial group has superior values, customs, and norms. So examples are making assumptions about certain groups. So X people are lazy, people in Y group are always drunk, Z people are all criminals. The next level up is interpersonal racism, and that's the actions occurring between individuals. So again, that's directed from an agent to a target. So this is not always overt, like using racist language. One example that comes up a lot in communication sciences literature is clinician unconscious bias against foreign accents and how this negatively affects relationship building with clients, and to the point where it affects client satisfaction and compliance with therapy and the clinical decision-making process. Now, racism at the institutional level refers to institutional practices that perpetuate racial inequality. So here, I'm just going to mention one of the elephants in the room in our profession, significant lack of diversity, which is itself one of the ways that institutional racism manifests, particularly in our profession. So again, the lack of diversity, the statistics, they're not a coincidence. It didn't just happen. It means that there are institutional practices in place in the education pipeline of a profession that creates barriers to access, particularly to Black and Indigenous individuals. Now, structural racism is racism that's backed up by societal power. These are the policies and procedures entrenched across social institutions, and they lead to racialized outcomes. And because they're entrenched across society, the root is often difficult to isolate. Now, structural racism is cumulative, pervasive, and durable. So one example is the overrepresentation of culturally and linguistically diverse clients on special education caseloads. So if you think about it for a minute, can you pinpoint the one reason for this? And the answer is no, because many intersecting factors come into play. It's not only how the healthcare and education systems are set up or not set up to diagnose and treat these children, but it's also, we have to think about disparate resource allocation to their communities and infrastructure. Think about things like access to quality childcare, healthcare, housing, early education opportunities, etc. So racism typically brings to mind discrimination on the basis of skin color, but often there's a strong intersection with culture that can go unacknowledged. So some key concepts to understanding this intersection are shown. As with the discussion about privilege earlier, white privilege is that set of unearned advantages, opportunities, and authorities that are afforded based solely on having white skin. Now, I'm well aware that in the wider social debate, there are many people who would argue that white privilege doesn't exist. So I just want to add here that acknowledging white privilege is not done in the spirit of erasing any effort or struggle to succeed or to have a good quality of life. It simply posits that there are additional barriers and disadvantages or hills to climb in society for people who are not white. And if you are white, it's going to be very difficult to understand what it is to not be white in a society where your experience is the norm. But if you are feeling some pushback within yourself when I speak about this, I ask you to just reflect back on that hallmark of privilege, and that it is often invisible to people who have it. Because white privilege does operate even in our professions. So as a practitioner in SLP or audiology, reflect on the following. During your training, were your professors of the same race as you, your classmates? Were your background, experiences, and perspectives reflected in your education? The majority of people who publish the research that you use for evidence-based practice, are they the same race as you? Does the research output from your profession reflect your voice, worldview, or truth? Are the people in positions of importance or decision makers in your profession? So think of the college, think of your workplace, think of our universities. Are they the same race as you? The board of directors that govern your workplace, are they the same race as you? If you work on a team, are your fellow SLPs or audiologists the same race as you? So if you're white, probably answered yes to many of those questions. And please recognize that by virtue of being white, your experience in these professions is normalized, and you have that ease of access and navigation, which people who are not white do not have. Similarly, think of our clients. White clients experience an ease of access and navigation in these professions, which clients who are not white do not. And so for healthcare and education professionals like ourselves, understanding Eurocentrism is also key, as it forms a basis for the educational models we were trained in and for the health and education systems that we operate within. So Eurocentrism is a tendency to interpret the world in terms of European values, perspectives, and the belief that they are superior. And both of these concepts of white privilege and Eurocentrism come into play when we talk about the dominant culture. I'm going to spend a little extra time here. Dominant culture is the culture whose values, language, and ways of behaving are imposed on a subordinate culture or cultures through economic or political power. And even with the extent of racial and ethnic diversity in Canada, the dominant culture is considered to be white, cisgender, straight, Christian, and English speaking. So in Canada, the white experience and often the Eurocentric experience is considered the norm. And understanding how the dominant culture operates is key in our professions. We know that culture affects many, many aspects of the clinical interaction. This can be the rules of interaction, views of disability, family structure and hierarchy, expectations of the roles of the client and the provider, comfort with touch and technology, familiarity with testing, the role of spirituality and religion, child rearing norms, parent-child interactions, expectations of independence, family involvement with therapy, etc., etc., etc. What I will ask you to think about from today is how much dominant culture norms are embedded in the judgments we make of clients. Be mindful when we're pathologizing, because a client who's not of the dominant culture cannot or will not assimilate or conform to dominant culture norms. In our professions, we often believe that there's one gold standard framework for client behavior, but really our referent is based on Western and Eurocentric ways of being and knowing. And so the white Eurocentric dominant culture can be considered a holdover of colonialism, which is an act of political and economic domination involving control of a country and its people by settlers from a foreign power. So even though the act of colonialism happened in the past, its effects still function in the present day as determinants of health. So colonialism is why Indigenous people have lower life expectancy than the general population, why Indigenous communities have higher rates of mental health concerns, chronic disease, infant mortality than the general population. And that's just a few of the racialized outcomes. Something that we need to keep in mind in our professions is that though the act of colonization occurred in the past, the history of abuse and mistreatment can remain strong in the historical memories of a cultural group and results in valid mistrust of social services and its providers. So assimilation is an impact of white privilege, Eurocentrism, the dominant culture, and colonialism. Assimilation is a process of denying and erasing the language, culture, customs, and material possessions of a group of people, forcing them to adopt to the systems of the dominant group. So residential schools are one example of forced assimilation. And the effects are still evident today in the SLP profession's engagement with First Nations languages and dialects. How many of us SLPs can say that we've been adequately trained, prepared, and equipped to accurately diagnose and offer language intervention to people who speak First Nations languages and dialects? There's a real lack of prioritization, lack of research, there's a lack of education and training available on First Nations language and dialects, and that is in itself a symptom of assimilation or the expectation of the use of standard English. So I will pass things over to Tegan to take us through the second half of the presentation.
All right. So this next slide covers some of what oppression looks like in practice. In the systems that we work in, the major impact of oppression is inequity. Inequity is the presence of systemic disparities in well-being or health among groups with different social advantage or disadvantages, such as wealth or power. It describes differential outcomes based on membership in marginalized groups. For example, life expectancy, mortality, disability, and so on. Canada's healthcare system is rightly a source of pride, and it's often thought of as equal and objective, but the fact is that some people do get better care than others, even in SLP and audiology. Inequities result from bias, which is a prejudice in favor of against one thing, person, or group compared to another, which influences the ability to evaluate a particular situation objectively or accurately. Some of us may be familiar with the term unconscious or implicit bias, which is the bias that forms outside of your conscious awareness. Because of our brain's tendencies to organize by categorization, we all hold these unconscious beliefs about different groups. Unconscious biases are more prevalent than conscious ones, and they may even be incompatible with our conscious values. They also tend to be more prevalent during times of stress or heightened negative emotions. So think working under tight deadlines, dealing with difficult clients, feeling frustrated or dysregulated. It might seem counterintuitive, but the best way to stop unconscious bias is to accept that they exist within you and to begin to monitor and analyze how they might be impacting your service delivery. When you notice yourself making a default assumption, take a second to push back against it, challenge it, and replace it with something more thought out. With repeated practice, the hope is that this internal examination becomes more of a default. Color blindness, which is the belief that all people should be treated equally without regard for their race, culture, or ethnicity as a way of preventing prejudice or discrimination, is sometimes viewed as a way to avoid negative bias. This is now considered counterproductive, though, because it promotes disengagement from issues around race and racism. It's a bit of a head in the sand approach. It ignores real racial disparities and inequities, and it ignores culture's differences that are meaningful to racialized people. The phrase, "I don't see color," is often said with the best of intentions by people who really want to treat everyone the same. But in order to counter oppression, we need to acknowledge that not only is it not possible to not see color, but that seeing color, or the cultural difference that it implies, is actually vital if we're to offer suitable and appropriate care. Not seeing color means that we would ignore real cross-cultural differences that might impact care, like the need for an interpreter, religious dietary restrictions during feeding and swallowing care, or how a client's religious wear will impact their hearing assessment or wearing of their hearing aids. Next, harassment is any unwanted physical or verbal behavior that offends or humiliates. This can be behavior that persists over time or serious one-time incidents. In the SLP and audiology context, it's hopefully very rare that clinicians direct harassing behavior towards clients. But it is not uncommon for racialized SLPs and audiologists to experience harassment directed from clients, colleagues, or workplace superiors. This can include refusal to be treated, questioning of qualifications, or use of derogatory language, things like that. And lastly, a microaggression is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. Microaggressions are also considered harassment because microaggressions offend or humiliate. These are cases where the perpetrator doesn't necessarily mean to cause offense or even realize that they have, because the comments are often accompanied by humor. So common examples are things like, "Where are you really from?" Or "How come you speak English so well? You don't sound Black." Or "You're a coconut, you're brown on the outside but white on the inside." Understanding the perspective of people who are not of the dominant culture is key to anti-racist service delivery. So this slide will go through some of those perspectives. First, racialization describes the process through which socially constructed racial categories are assigned and applied in ways that mark non-white individuals as different and unequal, and that lead to social, economic, and political impacts. While white people have a race, white culture or experience in Canada is considered the norm. And so white people may think of themselves as raceless and normal. This normalcy is defined only by the assumed otherness or abnormality of people of color. For a parallel example, think about how among English speakers, most people don't think of themselves as speaking with an accent, but they label and identify the accents of others. In truth, we know that everyone speaks with an accent unique to where they live and grew up, and the same is true of race. Underrepresentation occurs when members of discernible groups are not consistently present in representative bodies and among measures of well-being in numbers roughly proportionate to their numbers within the population. So for instance, in a given healthcare setting, what proportion of clients are racialized compared to the proportion of providers or managers? How are racialized groups doing in measures of health and wellness compared to the average? Underrepresented groups are usually marked by gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and/or religion. The discussion around representation is critical because representation is the key to designing systems of care that are suitable and appropriate and meet the needs of racialized people. This is because racialized people hold valuable experiential knowledge that is key to understanding their lives and experiences. Experiential knowledge is that knowledge that's gained through differential history and experience with oppression in society, and the ability of a group to articulate experience in ways unique to that group. Basically, as white people, we just can't understand what it means not to be white, especially in a society that normalizes and privileges the white experience. One example that encompasses these concepts is the finding from the medical literature that shows that racialized patients prefer to have racialized healthcare providers, even when specific cultural backgrounds are not the same. This is because racialized clients feel less judged, better understood, and more comfortable with racialized providers, as they're less likely to uphold and reinforce Western and Eurocentric cultural practices. The client and the provider both have the experiential knowledge of what it means to be racialized in society, and this impacts the quality of the clinical relationship. Now think of our professions and the lack of diversity in them, and how that lack of experiential knowledge may limit the perspectives and priorities in the professions and the ability to engage with diverse clients. The last concept we'll go through is double consciousness, or the ability of racialized people to interpret racial events from two perspectives, that of the dominant culture and their own at the same time. One important consideration for SLPs and audiologists is that very often racialized clients will have this double consciousness and may provide information that's in line with their knowledge of dominant culture norms rather than an accurate depiction of what's really going on, so as to avoid judgment of their cultural norms. So this brings us to a few slides which will explain key concepts in our response to racism and start to get into what we can do. So equity, diversity, and inclusion are big buzzwords. They're everywhere right now. So we'll just go through what all of those mean specifically. Equity is a strategy or approach that ensures that all members of society have fair and equal access to opportunities. Equity acknowledges uneven starting points for individuals in certain population groups and the barriers faced by such individuals. Equity takes a proactive approach to barrier reduction and providing accommodations so that every individual's differing needs are met in order to grow, contribute, and develop. Diversity refers to the characteristics that make people different from one another. Diversity is a characteristic of a group and describes the presence of individual differences between members of a group. These differences include demographic or identity diversity, so race, ethnicity, national origin, age, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, language or languages spoken, or disability, and it also includes differences in education, perspective, opinion, skills, and so on. Inclusion describes environments where every individual feels safe and welcome within the given setting, that their individual differences are recognized and valued, and that they have equal opportunities to contribute and that their contributions are valued. It's important to note that diversity does not automatically translate into inclusiveness. You can have a diverse workplace, but proactive steps have to be taken to ensure that it's also inclusive, where all individuals feel safe, connected, and valued. So what is anti-racism? Anti-racism means actively opposing racism. It's the process of identifying and eliminating racism enacted through changing systems, policies, procedures, and practices so that power is redistributed and shared evenly. Anti-racism requires an understanding of how racism affects the lived experiences of racialized individuals, as well as the systemic nature of racism. And if you're thinking that that seems like a lot, you're not wrong. I feel it's important to acknowledge that anti-racism, even for those of us with the best of intentions who really want to do this work, can be uncomfortable. For those of us who currently have more power than others simply because of the privileges we were born with, including whiteness, it's natural to feel threatened with talk of redistributing this power. I think it can even be challenging to admit that these imbalances exist. And that's why the work of anti-racism starts with taking stock of our own social position and recognizing our internal biases. Based on my own experience, I would say it's normal to feel and think things like, wait, but what have I done and how have I treated people in the past that may have contributed to their oppression? If what I was taught in terms of Eurocentrism and the superiority of the biomedical model is not the whole picture, what else is there and what else do I need to reevaluate? If I got to where I am because of privileges I didn't even recognize, what is my value here? Apparently, I don't know anything at all. How am I ever going to read and know everything I need to? As a white person, how do I contribute to and engage in anti-racism without swooping in like some kind of white savior that nobody actually needs? How do I talk about all these things I'm learning with my colleagues or with my family? Will they get it? I definitely don't have answers to all of those questions yet, but at least some can be answered by the concept of allyship. So, allies are defined as individuals who strive to end oppression through supporting and advocating on behalf of the oppressed. And for a bit of a more evocative definition, allyship is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluation in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. Three pillars of allyship that are reflected in the literature are knowledge and awareness, communication and confrontation, and action and advocacy. When we talk about knowledge and awareness, we're talking about things like educating ourselves on the experiences of equity-seeking groups and gaining an understanding of the foundational concepts of anti-racism and equity, which we're doing right now. Communication and confrontation refers to sharing our learnings with others and confronting instances of prejudice in the words or actions of others. And action and advocacy includes things like the tangible actions taken to support equity-seeking groups and challenging and changing oppressive systems and practices, among other things. To make these ideas a bit more concrete, we've taken some ideas from a number of organizations who are immersed in this work and grouped them thematically on this slide. So as allies, we are self-reflective. We acknowledge our privilege and power, we identify our biases, and we build our capacity to receive criticism and correction as a gift. We also embrace the emotions that come with allyship. Next, and I cannot stress enough how often this comes up, we listen. When we're in conversation with the equity-seeking groups we hope to serve, we listen more than we talk. We yield the floor, understanding that in this case, our ideas are rarely the most important. We follow and learn from a diverse group. This might be academically or professionally, but it could also be our social media feeds. We don't assume that we know what's needed, but we ask and we listen with a desire to understand another's perspective. We self-educate. This means that Google is our friend and that we don't expect free education from racialized people. And finally, we take action. We leverage our positions of privilege by asking questions like, who isn't represented at this table? And whose perspective is missing from this conversation? We ask about changes that could be made within our workplaces. We also amplify those voices that are not as easily heard. People often call this passing the mic or turning the spotlight. When we have a platform, we don't speak on behalf of those marginalized voices, but we make a way for folks to speak for themselves. So that is the end of the content section. Anti-racism requires that we apply these understandings as an additional lens in our clinical decision-making. SLPs and audiologists should be prepared not only to examine the relevant clinical details of a case, but to apply the concepts discussed today when using our clinical judgment. So to give you some practice with beginning to do that, we are going to look at a case scenario.